Catherine Hart arrived in Dustfield, New Mexico Territory on the morning of April the 3rd, 1882, with a carpetbag in one hand, a loaded derringer in the other, and the kind of expression that told every man on the platform she had already decided what she thought of him. She had not always been this way. There was a version of Catherine that had existed before the frontier took things from her. Before her father's cattle operation failed in the drought of 1878, before the men he trusted walked away with every last head and left the family with nothing but a deed to land so cracked and dry it looked like a broken plate. There was a version of Catherine that had believed in handshakes, in the honor of a working man's word, in the romantic notion that the West was a place where a person could build something real. That version had been buried somewhere along the road between Abilene and Grief. Now she was 24 years old, practically educated, fiercely practical, and utterly done with illusions. She had come to Dustfield because her aunt, Meredith Calloway, had written her a letter in the February of that year, explaining that there was a position available at the town's only schoolhouse. Dustfield needed a teacher. The previous one had married a rancher and moved north. The town council was willing to pay $12 a month and provide lodging in a modest room attached to the back of the building. It was not glamorous. It was not comfortable. But it was hers, and hers alone, and that counted for everything. The stagecoach driver had told her, during the long and brutal 3-day ride from Santa Fe, that Dustfield was a growing town. He said it with a kind of boastful pride that Catherine recognized as the pride of a man who had never had to grow anything himself. "Got a proper general store now," he had said, snapping the reins at his horses, "and a telegraph office, and a doctor, and a sheriff what actually stays sober most days." "Remarkable," Catherine had replied, in a tone that made the other passenger, an older merchant from Albuquerque, quietly look out the window. She had not meant to be unkind. She simply found that she had very little patience left for the performance of optimism that men like the stagecoach driver seemed to require of women like her. The town, as it turned out, was more substantial than she had expected. Main Street ran for about 4 blocks and was lined with wooden storefronts in various stages of completion, their painted signs bright against the weathered timber. There was a hotel called the Creosote Arms, which sounded more poetic than it had any right to, and a saloon called Danforth's that smelled of whiskey even at 10 in the morning with its doors still shut. There were children running between buildings, and a blacksmith working at an anvil whose ringing she could hear before she could see him, and 2 women talking outside a dry goods store with the comfortable ease of people who knew each other's whole stories. It looked, if she was being honest, like a place where a life could take root. She did not want to think that. She pushed it away. The schoolhouse was on the eastern edge of town, a single square building with 4 windows, and a bell above the door that had been painted red at some point, and had since faded to the color of old brick. The room attached to the back was small, a bed, a wood stove, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto open grassland. But it was clean, and someone had placed a small bunch of dried wildflowers in a tin cup on the windowsill, which Catherine stared at for a long time before she understood that the gesture had made her throat feel tight. She set her carpetbag down. She placed the derringer in the top drawer of the washstand. And she told herself very firmly that she was here to teach children and nothing else. She met Nelson Brooks on her 4th day in Dustfield, and she did not think much of him at first. She had walked to the general store, Whitmore's, to purchase a small supply of chalk and a few composition books that the town council had not yet gotten around to ordering. The store was long and dim, and smelled wonderfully of coffee and sawdust and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. There were perhaps 6 or 7 people inside, and Catherine was navigating around a barrel of pickled goods when she heard a voice outside, close to the hitching post, speaking in a low and unhurried way. She was not trying to eavesdrop, but the side window of Whitmore's was propped open with a piece of board, and the voice came through it as clearly as a bell. I know," the voice was saying. "That was a bad stretch back there. You did not have to carry me through those rocks, and you did it anyway. I am sorry I pushed you that hard. It was thoughtless of me." Catherine paused. She looked around to see if anyone else had reacted. Old Mr. Whitmore behind the counter was sorting invoices and not listening. A woman picking through bolts of calico appeared entirely absorbed. No one else seemed to find anything unusual about what was being said. Catherine moved closer to the window without quite admitting to herself that she was doing it. Through the gap between the board and the sill she could see the hitching post clearly. Tied to it was a horse, a bay mare with a white blaze down her nose, standing with her ears slightly back and her head low in the way horses do when they are genuinely tired. Beside her, one hand resting lightly on her neck in the particular way that is not a pat but something slower and more considered, stood a man. He was tall. That was the first thing. Not in an ostentatious way, just in the way of someone who had grown up out of doors and simply had the room for it. He wore a weathered brown hat, a pale shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and dusty trousers above worn boots. He had dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar, and his face, which was turned partly away from her, had the look of someone who spent considerable time squinting at the horizon. He was talking to his horse, not in the impatient, cursory way that men talked at their animals when they wanted them to move or stop moving. He was actually talking to her. There was cadence in it. There was remorse. He said, "We will rest here a good while, and tonight I will see you get a proper bucket of oats. That is a promise." The horse turned her head and pressed her nose briefly against the man's shoulder, and he laughed, a quiet, private laugh that did not seem to be performing itself for anyone, and scratched gently behind her ear. Catherine realized she had been standing at the window for considerably longer than she should have. She stepped back and continued to the counter, purchased her chalk and composition books, and walked back to the schoolhouse. She thought about the man with the horse only twice more that day, and told herself that both times were accidental. It was Meredith Calloway who introduced them, which in retrospect Catherine should have anticipated, because Meredith was the sort of woman who believed that people who needed to know each other always did eventually, and that the only kindness was to speed the process along. Meredith and her husband Thomas ran a small cattle operation on the southern side of town. They were not wealthy, but they were steady, which Catherine had always thought was the better of the two conditions. They had 3 children under the age of 10, and a front porch that seemed to perpetually hold either a pot of coffee or a dish of cooling pie, sometimes both. Meredith had invited Catherine to supper on a Friday evening 8 days after her arrival, and the house was warm and full of the smell of roasted chicken and cornbread, and the 3 children were eventually put to bed after a lively argument about who had correctly identified a particular star through the window. And then Thomas had poured a glass of whiskey for the adults, and the evening settled into that comfortable, almost drowsy ease of good company. It was then that Meredith said, in the particular offhand tone that meant she had been waiting to say it, "I imagine you have heard of Nelson Brooks by now." "I have not," Catherine said. Said Meredith, which was not an answer. "Who is he?" Thomas offered before his wife could arrange her expression into innocence. "He runs horses, has a place about 7 miles east up near the ridge, breaks them, trains them, sells them mostly to the cavalry, some to ranchers. He has been out here going on 3 years now, honest man, good with animals in a way that is hard to explain if you have not seen it. He is not married," Meredith added in a tone of supreme casualness. "I did not ask," Catherine said. "No," Meredith agreed pleasantly, "you did not." 2 days later, on a Sunday afternoon when Catherine had set herself to organizing the classroom shelves, she heard hoofbeats in the yard and looked out to find a bay mare with a white blaze standing just outside the schoolhouse fence, her rider swinging down with an easy, unhurried motion. She recognized the horse before she recognized the man. He had tied the mare to the fence post and was reaching into a saddlebag when Catherine appeared in the doorway, and he looked up, and his face showed the particular expression of a man who has come to deliver something but has not quite rehearsed the words. "Miss Hart," he said, "I am Nelson Brooks. I do not want to interrupt." "You are already here," she pointed out. He took that without offense, which she noted. "Meredith Calloway asked me to bring these over." He pulled from the saddlebag a small stack of books, old and well-thumbed but intact, a primer, 2 readers, and what appeared to be a geography text. She said the schoolhouse was short on materials and that these came from her children's old set. She thought you might find use for them. Catherine came down the steps and took the books from him. She looked at them briefly, then looked up at him, and found that up close his eyes were an unhurried shade of gray-green that she had not anticipated. "Tell her I am grateful," Catherine said. "You could tell her yourself," he said. "She will be at the church social on Tuesday." He paused. "I did not say that as a suggestion for you to attend anything. I only mean that she is easy to find. I know where my aunt lives." There was a brief silence in which a bird called somewhere in the grass, and the mare shifted her weight and exhaled loudly. "Your horse looks tired," Catherine said, before she had decided to say it. He turned and looked at the mare with a kind of immediate attentiveness that most men reserved for fellow humans, if that. "She has been a little stiff in the left foreleg this week. I should not have ridden this far today." He sounded genuinely troubled. "I will walk her back easy." "Is it serious?" "I do not think so. She had a bad landing last month in uneven ground. It has been coming good slowly." He looked at the mare again with that same careful quality, then seemed to remember Catherine was there. "I apologize. That is probably more than you wanted to know about a horse." "It was not," she said honestly. He looked at her for a moment, slightly surprised, and then said, "Well, I hope the books are useful." He untied the mare, checked her briefly with both hands running down that foreleg in a practiced, gentle examination, and then began to lead her, not ride her, lead her back along the road toward the ridge. Catherine stood on the schoolhouse steps and watched him go and thought about a man who rode 7 miles to deliver books and then walked his horse home. She went back inside and told herself the thought meant nothing. The school opened the following week with 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and Catherine discovered quickly that teaching in Dustfield was nothing like teaching in Abilene had been. Abilene had had structure. Dustfield had enthusiasm. The children were loud and curious and wildly varying in their existing knowledge, which meant that by the end of the first week Catherine was utterly exhausted and also, despite herself, thoroughly engaged. There was a boy named Henry Danforth, 12 years old, who read at a level that astonished her, and a girl named Pearl Vasquez, 9 years old, who could not yet read at all but who listened to everything with an intensity that suggested the deficiency would not last long. There was a pair of twins named Will and George Marley who spent considerable energy trying to convince her they were each other, a project they abandoned by Wednesday when it became clear she had already identified the difference in their hairlines. She liked the work. She liked it in the way she liked anything that asked something specific of her, that required her attention, and returned something real in exchange. She came home each afternoon with chalk dust on her dress and her mind still turning over the day's challenges, and she ate simple dinners at the small table by the window and graded compositions by lamplight, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the quiet satisfaction of a purpose. She did not see Nelson Brooks for nearly 2 weeks after the book delivery. When she did, it was at the church social Meredith had mentioned, which Catherine had attended not because of anything Meredith or Nelson had said, but because Pearl Vasquez's mother had invited her specifically, and Catherine had found it impossible to refuse the quiet hopefulness in that invitation. The social was held in the church hall, which was just the church with the pews pushed back against the walls to make room for tables of food, and a clear space where 2 men with a fiddle and a banjo were producing music with more energy than precision. It smelled of fresh bread and candle wax, and the particular warm, human smell of a building that is holding more people than it usually does. Catherine arrived with Meredith and Thomas and was almost immediately separated from them by the press of people wanting to greet her. She shook hands with the town councilman, a Mr. Aldous Fitch, who had the firm handshake and slightly patronizing manner of a man who believed teachers should be grateful for their positions. She met the doctor, a Dr. Emmett Hale, who was younger than she expected and had flour on his coat from baking, which he explained with an endearing embarrassment. She met a rancher named Cord Beaumont, who told her 3 times in the same conversation that Dustfield was a good town for people who were willing to work hard, the implication being that he had not yet determined whether she qualified. She was standing near the food tables with a glass of punch, watching the dancers and thinking about nothing in particular, when Nelson Brooks appeared at her elbow with the same quality of unhurried arrival that seemed characteristic of him. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Brooks," she replied. He was wearing a clean shirt and his dark hair had been combed, and he looked slightly less at ease indoors than he had outside, which she found inexplicably charming and immediately suppressed the finding. "Are you settling in all right?" he asked. "Reasonably well," she said. "The children are a project, but a good one." "Henry Danforth is sharp as a tack," Nelson said. "I knew his father, good people." "He is very bright," Catherine agreed. "He needs more material than I currently have to give him. I am writing to Santa Fe for more advanced texts." "That is the kind of thing that will matter to this town more than most people know," he said, and he said it simply, without the quality of trying to impress her, which meant it landed with a weight that a more deliberate compliment would not have. She looked at him sideways. "How long have you been in Dustfield?" 3 years this June." "And before?" "Colorado for a stretch, Texas before that." He paused. "Missouri originally." "You?" "Kansas," she said. "My family was in Abilene." Something passed across his face. "Abilene was rough country in the droving years." "It was," she said, and she kept her voice even because the droving years were also the years her father had lost everything to men who had come through Abilene on the back of those cattle drives and seen opportunity and taken it without conscience. He did not press further, which was another thing she noted about him. He seemed to understand, without being told, where the edges of a conversation were. They stood together for a while in a comfortable enough silence, watching the dancing, and then Meredith appeared between them like a small force of nature and swept Catherine off to meet the sheriff's wife. And when Catherine looked back, Nelson Brooks was talking to Thomas Calloway and laughing at something in a way that was easy and unguarded and made him look younger than he had seemed to her before. She danced once that evening with Dr. Hale, who was a competent and gentle dancer, and who told her she was already well regarded among the parents of her students, which pleased her more than she showed. On her way home through the warm April night, Meredith walked beside her and made no mention of Nelson Brooks at all, which Catherine knew meant Meredith was exercising remarkable restraint and expected credit for it. "He is a good man," Catherine said finally, because it seemed easier to say it unprompted. "I did not say anything," Meredith replied with great dignity. "You were thinking it very loudly." Meredith laughed, and the sound of it went up into the dark sky with the first stars, and Catherine felt something loosen in her chest without knowing quite what it was. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Catherine had not expected to find so quickly. School in the mornings and early afternoons. Planning and correspondence in the evenings. Sundays given over to reading and the occasional visit to Meredith's. The town arranged itself around her in the way that towns do when someone is genuinely present in them. People greeted her by name. The children waved from across the street. Mr. Whitmore at the general store began setting aside composition books whenever a shipment came in without her having to ask. She learned things about Dustfield in those weeks. She learned that it had grown up along a water source, a reliable spring-fed creek, that made it genuinely viable in a territory where water was the real currency. She learned that the sheriff, a quiet man named Amos Prout, had once been a cattle drover himself and understood the particular lawlessness that passed through a town like water through a sieve. and that he managed it with a patience and a firmness that the rougher element tended to respect. She learned that Cord Beaumont, the rancher who had tested her at the social, was actually a fair employer who had Mexican and Navajo workers on his spread and treated them reasonably, which was not universal in the territory and was worth acknowledging. She also learned, gradually and without particularly intending to, things about Nelson Brooks. He was 30 years old. He had come to the territory after several years working as a horse handler for the Army in Colorado, during which time he had saved enough to purchase the lease on his spread near the ridge and start his own operation. He was not wealthy, but he was solvent and building towards something. He had no family living. His parents had both died of fever when he was 17, and a younger brother had been killed in a mining accident in Colorado a few years later. He was alone in the specific way of someone who had experienced loss young enough for it to become part of his constitution, rather than a wound he was still carrying on the surface. She learned these things partly from Meredith, partly from Thomas, and partly from the gradual accumulation of small things Nelson said himself when they encountered each other, which they did with increasing frequency as the spring wore on. He had a habit of arriving at the schoolhouse on Saturday mornings with some useful thing or another. Once it was a fresh stack of wood for the stove, split and stacked before she woke. Once it was a brace of rabbits from a man in town who owed him a favor, accompanied by a note that said simply, "Thought you might be tired of salt pork." Once it was a small watercolor painting of the creek that he had clearly been embarrassed to bring and had left propped against the door without knocking, and she had found it when she opened the door and had stood holding it for a long time. She confronted him about it, gently, the next time she saw him. "The painting," she said. "It was you." He looked at the middle distance briefly in the way of a man accepting a responsibility. "My mother painted," he said. "She taught me some of it when I was young. I do not do it often." "It was beautiful," Catherine said. "I hung it in the schoolroom." He looked at her then, and something in his face shifted in the small, quiet way of a man who has been trying to give something lightly and has had it received with care. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." There was a pause between them that had a different quality than the pauses they had shared before. It was not uncomfortable. It was the opposite of uncomfortable, which was somehow more alarming. "I would like to bring some of the children to the ridge sometime," Nelson said, changing course with a gentleness that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. "Let them see the horses working, if you thought it would be useful to the schooling." "That is a generous offer," she said carefully. "I am not just being generous," he said. "I think there is something a child learns from watching how an animal is treated that they cannot learn from a book, but that is only my opinion." She thought about a man apologizing to his horse for having pushed her too hard. "I think you may be right," she said. They agreed on a Saturday in May. Catherine arranged it with the parents who were willing to let their children make the 7-mile ride, and in the end 8 of the 11 students came, along with herself and Meredith, who had inserted herself into the arrangement with the serene certainty that she was necessary. The ride to the ridge was through grassland that had gone green with the spring rains, punctuated by juniper and pinon, and the occasional dramatic red rock formation that rose up from the earth as though placed there deliberately. The air was warm and dry and smelled of sage, and the sky above was the wide, uninterrupted blue that Catherine had grown up knowing and had missed without being entirely aware of it during the years in town. Nelson's property was a modest spread, a low house of adobe and timber, a well-built barn, several strong corrals, and a pasture that ran up against the ridge itself. There were currently 14 horses in various stages of training, and the sight of them moving in the morning light, all that muscle and speed contained, and yet barely contained, made something rise in Catherine's chest that was entirely involuntary. He showed the children the horses with the kind of patient precision that she recognized as the same quality he brought to everything. He told them the names of each animal, described their temperaments with as much care as he might have used for people, and explained the process by which a frightened, suspicious animal came to trust a human through repetition, through consistency, through the absolute absence of cruelty. "They always know," he said to the children, crouching down to be level with the youngest ones, "whether you mean them well or whether you are only pretending to. You cannot fool a horse about that, so the only thing to do is actually mean it." Pearl Vasquez, who was 9 and who had barely spoken above a whisper in the 3 weeks since school had started, said, in a clear and wondering voice, "Is that how you make them trust you?" "That is the whole of it," Nelson said. "It is not complicated. It just takes patience." Catherine watched this and felt something she was wholly unprepared for, which was the specific ache of recognizing in another person a quality you had believed you would never find. She spent the afternoon helping the children with a drawing exercise. They were to sketch one of the horses as accurately as they could, while Nelson and Thomas worked in the far corral with a young stallion who was just beginning his training. She found herself watching him more than she watched the drawings. He worked the stallion with a long lead rope and a patience that was almost meditative. There was no force in it. When the horse shied and pulled away, he simply waited, the rope slack in his hands, his body language so carefully non-threatening that even Catherine, watching from 40 yards away, could feel the deliberate quality of his stillness. Gradually the horse came back, and each time it did, Nelson's response was the same: a soft word, a hand on the neck, and then the work continued. It was one of the most quietly beautiful things she had ever seen, and she was not a woman given to romanticizing. On the way home, with the children tired and satisfied and full of the bread and dried fruit Meredith had brought, Meredith rode beside Catherine and said nothing for a comfortable stretch of miles. Then she said, "You like him?" "He is a good man," Catherine said, which was the 3rd time she had said that about him now, and even she could hear what that meant. "Catherine," Meredith said, and her voice was gentle in the way that only came from genuine love, "your father's situation was not your fault, and the men who took advantage of him were not all men. They were particular men who chose a particular thing. You know that." "I know it intellectually," Catherine said. "You need to know it in the rest of you too," Meredith said, "and I think maybe you are starting to." Catherine did not answer, but she did not deny it either. And in the silence the grassland moved around them like a slow green sea, and the ridge behind them turned gold in the late afternoon light, and somewhere back at the corrals, a man was probably still talking to his horse. She thought about that all the way home. May deepened into June. The evenings were long and warm, the kind that pulled people outdoors after supper and kept them there until the first stars appeared. Catherine had fallen into a habit of walking in the early evenings along the creek that ran east of town, where the cottonwoods had leafed out, and the water made a sound that was clean and constant and steadying. Nelson had a habit, she discovered, of coming into town on Tuesday and Friday evenings to conduct whatever business needed conducting: the blacksmith for shoeing, the general store for supplies, the bank when necessary. She knew this only because she had noticed it, a fact she allowed herself to acknowledge without further examination. On the 2nd Tuesday of June, she was sitting on the low bank of the creek with her shoes off and her feet in the cool water, reading a letter from a friend in Abilene, when she heard hoofbeats and then the sound of someone dismounting upstream and tying a horse to a cottonwood branch. Nelson came through the trees with his hat in his hand and stopped when he saw her. "I am sorry," he said immediately. "I did not know anyone came here in the evenings. I will go the other way." "You do not have to," she said, surprising herself. He stood at the edge of the tree line for a moment, then came down and sat a respectful distance away on a flat stone, his hat turning slowly in his hands. "Good letter?" he asked, nodding at the pages she was holding. "An old friend," she said. "She married last year. She says she is happy." "Do you believe her?" Catherine considered. "Yes, she has always been honest about her feelings. It is one of the things I have always admired about her." "That is a useful thing to be," he said quietly. They were quiet for a while. The creek ran past them. Above the cottonwoods the sky was turning from pale gold to the first soft haze of orange, and the light fell on the water in shifting pieces. "Can I ask you something?" Nelson said. "You can ask," she allowed. "Meredith told me, not in any way that was not kind, that your family had a hard time in Abilene with the land business." He paused. "I only mention it because you seem, I do not know the right word, braced, like you are expecting something bad to happen." Catherine took a breath. "My father trusted people he should not have," she said. "He was a good man with a good instinct for the land, but he believed that most people operated from the same honesty he did. They did not. We lost everything in the space of about 8 months. He never recovered from it. He died 2 years later." She stopped. "So yes, I am braced." Nelson was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not immediately rush to fill the space with reassurances. "I am sorry about your father," he said finally. "That kind of loss, the double kind, where you lose the thing and then you lose the person, is a particular weight." "Yes," she said, "it is. I am not going to tell you that not all men are like that," he said carefully. "You know that, and it is not the point anyway. The point is that you were hurt, and it makes sense that you are careful." "That seems reasonable to me." She looked at him. "Most people tell me I should trust more, that I am too guarded." "Most people have not had your reasons," he said simply. Something opened in her chest then, slow and careful, like a door on hinges that had not been turned in a long time. "What about you?" she asked. "You have had losses too." "I have," he said. "My parents, my brother." He looked at the water. "My brother was the hard one. He was 22. He had a laugh that you could hear from 2 rooms away. After he died, I spent about a year being very angry at everything, which is not a useful state for a man who works with horses. They kept telling me." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and he turned to look at her with an expression of pure, uncalculated pleasure at the sound. "Telling you," she said. "Horses say things," he said entirely seriously. "Not in words, but if you are paying attention. They were telling me every day that I was bringing the wrong energy, so eventually I had to sort myself out." He paused. "I do not recommend the angry year, but the other side of it is reasonably good." "The other side of it," she repeated. "It is different for everyone," he said. "But there is one, usually." They sat by the creek until the stars came out, talking about things that were small and large in turns. His horses, her students, the territorial politics that were making cattle operations complicated throughout New Mexico, the book she was planning to request from the Territorial Education Office, the strange beauty of the desert at night, which neither of them could quite explain but both recognized. When she finally put her shoes back on and gathered her letter, she found him standing and offering a hand to help her up the bank, which was steeper than it looked in the evening dimness. She took the hand. His was warm and very steady, and he did not hold it a moment longer than was necessary, and he said good night with the same simplicity he brought to everything. She walked back to the schoolhouse with her heart doing something that she chose not to name yet. June passed, and July came in hot and bright. The school took a recess for the summer in the second week of July, as was the custom, and Catherine found herself with a quantity of unstructured time that she had not anticipated finding uncomfortable. She visited Meredith. She wrote letters. She organized the schoolroom shelves 3 times over. She read 2 books she had been putting off. She walked along the creek in the evenings and told herself she was not listening for hoofbeats. On a Thursday afternoon in the middle of July, with the heat pressing down on Dustfield like a flat iron, she decided to ride out to Nelson's property. She borrowed Meredith's gentle sorrel mare, Penny, and rode the 7 miles through the shimmer of the midday heat, and when she arrived she found Nelson in the barn with the bay mare, whose name, she now knew, was Clover, running his hands carefully along that left foreleg with an expression of focused concern. "The stiffness again?" Catherine asked, tying Penny to the fence and coming in out of the sun. He looked up and his face registered surprise and then something warmer than surprise. "It came back this week," he said. "She turned on that leg wrong in the corral yesterday. She is all right, but I am resting her." He paused. "I did not expect to see you." "It is summer holiday," she said. "I found I had too much nothing to do." He sat back on his heels and looked at her with a quiet amusement. "I can fix that. I have a young mare in the east pasture who needs working on the lead and a fence line on the north side that needs checking, and enough wood to split to keep me busy until October. Then put me to work," she said. He did. Not at the fence line or the wood, but at the lead work with the young mare, where it turned out that Catherine had enough of her old farm upbringing to be genuinely useful. She held the lead while Nelson worked around the horse, showing Catherine the signals and the responses, and by the afternoon's end, the young mare was noticeably calmer, and Catherine was dusty and warm and more alive than she had felt in weeks. They ate supper at the rough table in his kitchen, dried beans and cornbread and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and the talk was easy and wide-ranging. And at one point, he told her about his mother's garden in Missouri, how she had grown roses in a climate that barely tolerated them through sheer refusal to accept impossibility, and his voice had in it a tenderness that was entirely unguarded. And Catherine looked at him across the table and felt the words she had been refusing to name settle firmly and quietly into her heart. She rode home in the long blue light of early evening, and she let herself think it plainly. She was falling in love with Nelson Brooks. She was falling in love with a man who worked the frontier, a man who worked horses on a spread in New Mexico territory, a man who was exactly the kind of man she had sworn she would never trust. She let herself think it, and then she thought about what he had said by the creek, about the other side, and she rode the rest of the way home with her face tipped up toward the sky. After that Thursday, things moved with the easy inevitability of a river finding its course. She began riding out to his place on Tuesdays and Saturdays, when there was nothing pressing in town. He came into Dustfield on his usual days, but now stopped at the schoolhouse rather than simply passing, and they fell into conversations that lasted longer each time, conversations that wandered through the practical and the personal and the philosophical in a way that she had not had with anyone since her father, who had been the sort of man who thought out loud and expected you to think back. The townspeople noticed, of course. Dustfield was not so large that anything was private. Meredith noticed and was radiantly, carefully quiet about it. Thomas noticed and seemed simply pleased. Dr. Hale caught Catherine's eye at the post office one morning and smiled in a way that told her the news was general. Even Cord Beaumont, who had unbent considerably toward her over the months and now seemed to regard her with something approaching respect, told her one morning in front of the general store that Brooks was a fair man and good stock, which was, she understood, a high compliment from a cattleman. What she had not expected was that there were still moments of genuine difficulty. Not between them, but within herself. There were days when the old guardedness rose up cleanly and absolutely, when something small, the way a sentence landed wrong, a moment when plans changed without warning, would trigger a cold, reflexive withdrawal, and she would find herself going quiet in the exact way she had been quiet in the years after Abilene, and feel the familiar settled certainty that the safest place was inside herself. Nelson noticed these moments. She knew he did. But he never pushed at them or tried to reason her out of them or, worse, performed hurt feelings to make her feel guilty. He simply continued to be what he was: steady, present, patient, honest, and waited. It was on a Saturday in August, the air outside so hot it had a weight to it, that they had their first genuine disagreement. She had ridden out to find him already deep in conversation, if conversation was the right word for a negotiation that included raised voices, with a man she had not seen before. He was heavy-set and well-dressed in the manner of someone with money but not taste, and he was standing at the corral fence looking at Nelson's horses with the assessing quality of a buyer who has decided the seller does not know what they have. The man's name, she learned afterward, was Harlan Voss. He was a rancher from the eastern part of the territory who wanted to purchase 5 of Nelson's best horses at a price that Nelson was refusing, because the price was significantly below what the horses were worth, and because Nelson had already shaken hands on an agreement to sell 4 of those horses to a family whose small ranch was 3 days' ride south. That family waited 2 months, Nelson said, with a flatness that she recognized as genuine anger held very still. I gave them my word. Words are not contracts, Voss said. Mine are, Nelson said. Voss eventually left, unhappy, and Nelson stood at the fence for a moment with his hands on the top rail, looking at nothing, and then he turned and saw Catherine, and something in his face cleared. Sorry you had to see that, he said. I am not, she said. You did the right thing. It cost me, he admitted. The money from his offer would have paid off the last of my bank note. And the family in the South, they needed these horses to work a ranch that has been struggling. He shook his head. I was not going to break that agreement. She walked over to him and stood beside him at the fence, looking at the horses. The men who ruined my father, she said carefully, they were men like Harlan Voss, men for whom a word was nothing, men for whom there was always a better offer. He turned to look at her. You are not like them, she said. I have known it for a while, I think. I wanted to say it plainly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Catherine, I have been wanting to say something to you for some time now, and I have been trying to find the right moment, and I am not sure there is a right moment, so I am just going to say it. She felt her heart move in her chest. I am in love with you, he said. I have been since approximately the second time I brought you things and you looked at them like you were genuinely pleased and were trying not to show it. I am telling you because I think you deserve to know it, and not because I am expecting anything in particular from you. If you need more time, or more quiet, or more, Nelson, she said. He stopped. I am in love with you too, she said. I have been fighting it for a rather unreasonable length of time, and I am tired of fighting it. The look on his face was not triumph. It was not the satisfied look of a man who has achieved a goal. It was simpler and more private than that. It was the look of a man who has been carrying something carefully for a long time and has finally been told he can set it down. He reached out and took her hand, the same steady, warm hand she remembered from the creek bank, and held it. All right then, he said quietly, as if it were a kind of vow. All right, she agreed. They stood at the fence in the August heat, with the horses moving in the corral and the ridge rising gold behind them. And Catherine thought that this was a thing she had not believed would ever be entirely safe, and had turned out, after all, to be the safest thing she had ever done. The fall came in gradually, the heat softening and the evenings turning cool, and with it came the particular fullness of a life that is being built rather than merely lived. Catherine's school reopened in September with 14 students this time. 3 new families had arrived in Dustfield over the summer, a sign that the town was continuing its careful growth. Among the new students was a quiet boy of 11 named James Cole, whose family had come from Tennessee, and who arrived on the first day with a watchfulness that Catherine recognized immediately as the watchfulness of someone who had been disappointed by places before. She made no special fuss over him. She simply made sure he was never invisible, that his work was noticed and named aloud when it was good, which it often was. By October he was no longer watchful. He was simply present. Nelson sold his horses to the family in the South and came back from that 3-day trip with a letter from the family's father that he showed Catherine without comment. The letter was brief and awkward in its grammar, but absolutely clear in its feeling. It thanked Nelson for honoring his word when he did not have to, and said that with those horses they would be able to bring in their first real harvest, and that they were grateful in a way that was hard to put in writing. She kept that letter. She did not ask his permission. She simply folded it carefully and placed it in her drawer with the letter from her Abilene friend, and when he saw her do it, he said nothing, but the expression on his face said more than enough. Their courtship, if that word was adequate for what they were doing, was conducted largely in the spaces between work, in the Tuesday and Saturday visits, in the evenings by the creek as the weather allowed, in the long conversations that continued to range widely and honestly and occasionally into territory that was uncomfortable and thereby important. She told him one evening in September, about the night the men had come to take the remaining cattle and her father had stood on the porch and not said a single word, not bargained or pleaded or threatened, just watched them go with a look on his face that was worse than anger. She had been 15. Nelson listened. He did not try to fix it or contextualize it or make it smaller. He simply listened and then said, "That was a terrible thing for a child to carry." "I am not a child anymore," she pointed out. "No," he agreed, "but you were then, and that part of you still carries it, I think. It is allowed to." She thought about that for days. He told her in turn about Colorado, about the years working for the Army there, which had been educational in ways that the curriculum of his limited schooling had not provided. He told her about the Ute people he had encountered during those years, and about the injustice of the federal policies that were, in 1882, still systematically removing tribal peoples from lands they had lived on for generations, and about the particular helplessness of watching a wrong happen at a scale you cannot individually address. "It is not right," he said plainly. "It has never been right. And the fact that it happens to the benefit of people like me, people who get to come west and build something, does not sit easy with me. I do not know what to do with that exactly, but I know it is true." "A lot of men would not say that," she said. "A lot of men are wrong," he said simply. She loved him for that. She loved him for a great many things. The question of marriage arose in October, not as a grand romantic gesture, but in the quietly practical way that large, important decisions often come when two people are being genuinely honest with each other. They were sitting on the steps of his house in the last warm hour of an October evening, watching the horses in the pasture, and Clover was there among them, her foreleg fully healed and her movement easy and unencumbered, and Nelson had his arm around Catherine's shoulders in the easy way that had become natural over the past months. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if that is something you want." "Is that a question or a statement?" she asked. "Both," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Yes," she said, "it is something I want." He exhaled slowly, and she could feel the breath of it against her hair. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I am not asking because I want something from you. I am asking because you are the most important person in my life, and I would like that to be formal and permanent." "I know why you are asking," she said. "I trust you." The words settled between them with a significance she felt in her whole body. They were not words she had said lightly in her life, and he knew it, and the knowing was quiet and serious and deeply kind. They told Meredith first, which was appropriate given that she had been managing the situation with barely contained glee since April. Her reaction was to burst into tears, clap her hands, and immediately begin discussing the practicalities of where the ceremony would be held, which she clearly had opinions about, all of which she delivered in a rush that left both Catherine and Nelson standing in her kitchen with the kind of bemused happiness that is only possible in the company of people who love you. Thomas shook Nelson's hand and then, unexpectedly, pulled him into a brief, firm embrace, which Nelson received with visible surprise and then a kind of grateful steadiness. They were married on the 14th of November, 1882, on a day that began cold and turned clear by noon, which the whole town treated as a favorable sign. The ceremony was at the church, conducted by the pastor, a kind and somewhat verbose man named Reverend Elias Morrow, who had the good sense to keep his words to the essential and the beautiful. Catherine wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself over the October weekends, and she wore her dark hair up with a small spray of dried wildflowers, the same kind that had been in the tin cup on her windowsill on the day she arrived, which she had decided was not a coincidence she was going to ignore. Nelson stood at the front of the church with Thomas beside him, and looked at her coming up the aisle with the expression of a man encountering something he had hoped for but not entirely let himself believe in. The 14 children of the Dustfield school had placed themselves in the pews to the left without being asked, and when she passed them, Pearl Vasquez Pearl, who had come so far from the silent girl of September, whispered, very clearly, "You look wonderful, Miss Hart," and Catherine had to concentrate hard on the next 3 steps to keep her eyes dry. She reached Nelson. He took her hands. "Catherine Hart," Reverend Morrow began, and she kept her eyes on Nelson's face and thought about a man at a hitching post speaking carefully and honestly to a tired horse, and how that had been the beginning of everything. The vows were the traditional words, but she meant each one with the full particular weight of someone who did not say things she did not mean, and she heard him say them the same way. And when the Reverend declared them husband and wife, Nelson kissed her in a way that was brief and warm and entirely him. And the church made the warm, celebratory sound of a room full of people who are genuinely pleased. The reception was at the Calloway house, Meredith having apparently arranged a celebration sufficient for twice the number of people present, which meant there was enough food and warmth for the evening to become long and full and wonderful. There was music again, the same fiddle and banjo from the social back in April, and this time Catherine danced more than once, first with Nelson, which she discovered he did with the same unhurried, attentive quality he brought to everything, and then with Thomas, and then, briefly and laughingly, with Henry Danforth, who had determined that 12 was old enough to be a proper partner and executed the steps with enormous concentration. Nelson danced with Meredith, who beamed at him throughout, and with Pearl Vasquez's mother, who had cried quietly during the ceremony in a way that had started several other people going, and with young Pearl herself, who treated the honor with tremendous seriousness. Late in the evening, Catherine and Nelson found a quiet moment on the porch with a glass of cider each and the November cold coming in at the edges of the warm air from inside, and she leaned against him and looked at the stars, which were very bright and very clear in the desert sky. "All right?" he asked. "Very all right," she said. "You?" "The best I have ever been," he said, and she believed him completely. They moved into his house on the ridge, which required certain adjustments on both their parts, but which proved, as most things between them did, to be more workable than complicated. The adobe house was low-ceilinged and warm, and Catherine's books took up considerable space on the shelves he built along the south wall, and her dried herbs hung in the kitchen alongside his. And within 6 weeks the house had the quality of something that belonged equally to 2 people. She continued at the school, riding the 7 miles each way on Penny, who had become her own horse by virtue of Meredith's insistence. Nelson continued his horse operation, which grew steadily through the winter as his reputation among buyers in the territory became more established. The cavalry contracts were his most reliable income, and the Army purchasing officer who made the regular rounds was a man named Captain Dalton, a fair-minded Vermonter who appreciated quality and said so in the direct way of someone who did not deal in flattery. Winter on the ridge was colder than it had been in town, and the nights were long, and Catherine found she did not mind. She graded compositions by the fire while Nelson worked at the table with his accounts, or with the small watercolors he had begun painting more regularly since she had hung the first one in the schoolroom. She would look up from a student's composition about the importance of rivers to find him absorbed in some small landscape of the territory, his face quiet with the particular peace of a person doing exactly what they are meant to be doing, and she would feel something that she could only describe as the satisfaction of a right placement, like a piece of a puzzle that had found the right space. In the spring of 1883, the school expanded to 20 students as Dustfield continued to grow, and the town council voted to increase her salary to $15 a month and authorized a second room to be built onto the schoolhouse for the older students. She supervised the building of it herself, which surprised the town council, who had expected her to simply receive the decision rather than participate in its execution, and which did not at all surprise Nelson. The same spring brought the news that a railway spur was being surveyed through the territory, with a possible connection to Dustfield. This was the subject of considerable discussion in the town, divided roughly between those who saw it as prosperity and those who saw it as disruption, And Catherine found herself in the middle of it at a town council meeting where Cord Beaumont was making the case for the railway with his characteristic direct force. She had stood up and said, because she had been asked, and because she had thought about it carefully, that the railway would change Dustfield in ways that could not be fully predicted, and that the town should think carefully about the kind of change it wanted, and that the people who would be most affected by the change were often not the people who had the most voice in the decision about it. She said it clearly and without drama, and the council room was quiet for a moment afterward, and then Amos Prout, the sheriff, nodded slowly and said that was a fair point and he thought it worth considering. Cord Beaumont had looked at her with an expression that was now unambiguously respectful and said, "She is right, we ought to think it through." Nelson had heard about it from Thomas before she got home and was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee looking quietly pleased in a way that was more eloquent than most speeches. "You heard," she said, dismounting. "Thomas was very excited about your speech," he said. "It was not a speech," she said. "It was an observation." "It was a speech," he said. "A good one." She took his coffee cup and had a sip of it without asking. "Give me my coffee back," he said. "No," she said, and went inside, and he laughed behind her with that private, uncalculating laugh she had first heard through the window of Whitmore's general store more than a year ago. By the summer of 1883, she knew she was carrying their first child. She told Nelson on a June evening in the pasture where he was checking the horses at the end of the day, and she stood beside Clover, who was old enough to be semi-retired now and was accordingly pleased with herself, and said simply, "I believe we are going to have a child." He went still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her with a brightness in his face that was so entirely unguarded that she felt the full weight of it press behind her eyes. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was who he was. "I am very well," she said. He came to her and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a moment that lasted and lasted, and then he kissed her forehead and held her close with a carefulness that was not fragility, but the opposite of it, the strength of something choosing to be gentle. "I am going to be a father," he said quietly as if testing the words. "You are," she said. He pulled back and looked at her again, and there were tears in his eyes that he did not bother to hide or explain, and she loved him for that too. Meredith's reaction, when told, was to produce a list of practical preparations she had apparently been keeping ready for exactly this moment, which suggested a level of premeditation that should have been shocking but was entirely Meredith. The pregnancy was, in Catherine's own assessment, unremarkable in the good sense. She continued at the school through September, and then took leave as October began, and her students were handed temporarily to a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Alvarez, who had taught in Santa Fe for 20 years and who agreed to come to Dustfield for 3 months with only minor persuasion. The baby arrived on a cold, clear morning in November, the 9th of November, 1883, almost exactly a year to the day since their wedding, and he was a boy. A solid, dark-haired boy with his father's gray-green eyes and what appeared to be his mother's expression of considered assessment, even in the first hours. They named him Samuel James Brooks, Samuel for Nelson's father and James because it had come to them both in the same moment, which seemed reason enough. Nelson held him first after Catherine, and stood at the window of their bedroom looking at his son with an expression of complete, overwhelming love that was entirely transparent, and for which Catherine knew she would hold the memory for the rest of her life. "Hello," Nelson said to the baby, in the same low, unhurried tone he used for horses and for difficult conversations and for apologies. "I am your father. I intend to be very glad of that." The baby made a sound. "He is talking back already," Catherine said from the bed, exhausted and happier than she had words for. "Good," Nelson said. "He has his mother in him." She laughed, and it hurt a little, and she did not care in the slightest. Samuel grew through the winter with the same focused intensity he had brought to his entrance, and the house on the ridge had a new quality to it, louder and less ordered and fuller in a way that made every room seem more completely itself. Mrs. Alvarez managed the school through January, and in February Catherine returned, bringing Samuel with her for the first weeks until he was old enough to be left with the neighboring family, the Orozcos, who had moved to a spread about a mile from theirs in the fall and whose eldest daughter, a capable 16-year-old named Rosa, had become an invaluable presence in their lives. The school by February of 1884 had 23 students, and the town council, under pressure from Catherine and from the growing number of parents who understood what the school was doing for their children, had voted to fund a second teacher. The new teacher was a young man from Albuquerque named David Park, fresh out of the Territorial Teachers College, earnest and excellent, and Catherine was glad to have him. There is a particular quality to a life that is lived fully, not a life without difficulty, but a life where the difficulties are met with the resources of genuine partnership, where the work is meaningful and the love is real, and the place where you live has been chosen and not merely landed in. Catherine had not always believed she would have such a life. She had spent several years believing that the price of keeping herself safe was to keep herself separate, and the frontier had seemed to her, for a long time, a place that demanded everything and returned only uncertainty. What she had found instead, through a window in a general store, through a man with his hand on a tired horse's neck, speaking with remorse and care, was that the frontier was also a place where a person could encounter the specific human quality of genuine decency, where a man could tend his animals with respect and conduct his business with honor and give his word and mean it and walk 12 miles home rather than push a stiff horse further than she should go. It was the summer of 1884. 2.5 years after she had arrived in Dustfield with a carpetbag and a derringer, and the absolute conviction that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford, when Catherine sat on the porch of the house on the ridge with Samuel on her knee and Nelson at her side, and thought clearly about all of this. Samuel, not yet 9 months old but enthusiastically mobile, was attempting to reach the edge of the porch with the persistence of someone who had already decided that the only real obstacle was proximity. Nelson had one hand loosely on the baby's back without stopping him, just there. The horses were in the pasture. Clover was near the fence, which was her habit, as if she liked the proximity of people. The ridge rose behind them in the long evening light, and the grassland below was green with the summer, and somewhere in the distance a hawk was making its slow circles above nothing in particular. "I have been thinking," Catherine said. "Tell me," he said. "I have been thinking about when I arrived," she said. "The certainty I had that this place and the people in it were not to be trusted." And, he said. He was not rushing her, he was never rushing her. "And I think," she said carefully, "that the certainty was not entirely wrong. Some of it was true and worth keeping." That said be careful, the part that said watch how a person behaves when something is at stake. She paused, but I had added to that a conclusion that went further than the evidence, that because I had been hurt I would always be hurt, that because men had failed my father men were failing things. Nelson said nothing, he was listening. "And then I watched a man apologize to his horse," she said, "and it seemed so simple and so unreasonable that it should matter that much." "Why did it matter?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in it, not a prompt for flattery. She thought about it. "Because it was unnecessary," she said finally. The horse would not have known the difference. She was not going to refuse to carry him if he did not say sorry. He did it because it was true and because he meant it. That is not a small thing. That is who a person is. He was quiet for a moment. "I am not a perfect man," he said. "I know that," she said, and she said it warmly. "I will make mistakes," he said. "You already have," she said. "Remember in March when you forgot to tell me about the visiting buyer and I had ridden all the way out here and found the whole corral full of strangers?" "I remember," he said, with the expression of a man who definitely remembered. "And you apologized," she said, "genuinely, without excuses or deflections, and you fixed the thing that had caused it." "It still bothers me," he said. "That is what I mean," she said. "It still bothers you. That is who you are." He turned and looked at her, and Samuel, apparently bored with the philosophical direction of the conversation, grabbed Nelson's shirt collar with both hands and tugged it with the authority of someone who has decided the attention should redirect. All right," Nelson said to his son, and lifted him up and held him against his shoulder, and Samuel made a sound of profound satisfaction. "I want to have another one," Catherine said. Nelson looked at her over Samuel's head. "A child," she clarified, with a level of calm she was rather proud of. "I knew what you meant," he said, and his expression was so completely happy that she felt it land in her like sunlight. "In a year or two," she said, "when Samuel is walking steadily and preferably not throwing his food." "He got that from you," Nelson said. "He absolutely did not," she said. The evening moved around them, warm and undemanding, and the hawk finished its circles and went wherever hawks go at dusk, and Clover came closer to the fence and regarded them with the particular expression of a horse who knows she is well cared for and considers this the proper arrangement. Dustfield grew. The railway spur came through in 1885, which brought exactly the mixture of opportunity and disruption Catherine had predicted at the town council meeting, and she was asked, eventually, to join a civic committee charged with managing the town's response to the expansion. She served on it for 2 years and found it demanding and useful and occasionally infuriating in the way that public service is when people care about opposite things with equal conviction. The school grew with the town. By 1886, there were 41 students and 3 teachers, and the building had been expanded twice, and the Territorial Education Office had cited the Dustfield School as a model for frontier education, a citation that Catherine accepted with appropriate modesty, and then hung in the schoolroom where her students could see it. Pearl Vasquez had become, by 14, the finest student in the school. Her reading was extraordinary, her writing precise and vivid, and she had a mathematical mind that Catherine had recognized early and deliberately cultivated. She was the first student Catherine recommended to the Territorial High School in Santa Fe, and when Pearl's acceptance came in the spring of 1887, Catherine received the letter with Pearl's mother in the kitchen of the Vasquez home, and they had both cried freely and without embarrassment. Nelson's horse operation had become one of the most respected in the territory. He had expanded the spread and taken on 2 hands, a quiet, skilled young man named Roberto Esquivel, who had grown up on a rancho south of Albuquerque, and had more natural talent with horses than anyone Nelson had encountered except possibly himself, and an older man named Frank Dillard, who was not especially gifted with horses, but was the most methodical and honest worker Nelson had ever employed, and who could fix anything mechanical with a resourcefulness that bordered on genius. He had also, by 1886, acquired a reputation for something beyond his horses, though the reputation was quieter and less formally known. He had extended informal credit to 3 small ranching families when drought made their operations precarious, credit he did not press for when recovery was slow, and he had trained horses for 2 families who could not afford his normal rates at rates they could afford, because he had assessed the families and determined they were trying to build something real, and that was a reason that outweighed the ledger. He never discussed these arrangements publicly. Catherine knew about them and had asked him once why he did not tell people since it was worth knowing. "It is not done for them to think well of me," he said. "It is done because it is the right thing." She had said, "I am aware." "I am asking why you keep it quiet." He thought about it. "Because if I tell it, it becomes about me. If I do not tell it, it is just a thing that happened and helped somebody." She had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You are a very good man, Nelson Brooks." He had looked faintly embarrassed, which she also loved. Their second child was born in the spring of 1886, another boy, which surprised them both, and which they took as the particular humor of an indifferent universe. They named him William Thomas Brooks, for Nelson's grandfather and for Thomas Calloway, who received the honor with a directness of emotion that made him leave the room briefly and return with somewhat reddened eyes. William was, from the first days, completely different from Samuel. Where Samuel had been observant and contained and fundamentally serious, William was loud and joyful and in perpetual motion, and the house on the ridge acquired a new register of noise that took some adjustment. Samuel regarded his brother with the measured assessment of a scientist observing a phenomenon he could not entirely classify. "He is very loud," Samuel said to his father at age 3.5 about his newborn brother. "He is," Nelson agreed. "Why is he so loud?" "He has a great deal to say," Nelson said. "Give him time and he will say it in words." Samuel considered this. "What is he saying now?" "That he is here," Nelson said simply. "That he exists, that he is glad of it." Catherine, overhearing from the other room, pressed her hand briefly over her mouth. The years moved in the way that full years do, not quickly, exactly, but with a completeness that made looking back feel like looking at a country you have thoroughly walked and know from the inside. Each year had its particular texture. The hard winter of 1886 that killed 2 of Nelson's horses and sent temperatures below anything the territory had seen in a decade. The summer of 1887, when Dustfield's well ran low, and the water committee on which Catherine served worked for 3 months to address it, ultimately drilling a new well with significant help from the railway's engineering team. The spring of 1888, when Meredith had her 4th child, a girl she named after Catherine, and Catherine had stood in that bedroom holding the baby with a love that felt like it had been accumulating for years. Through all of it, through every ordinary and extraordinary day, the thing that Catherine returned to was the simple, reliable truth that she had built well. She had not been lucky in the passive sense. She had been careful and honest and willing, finally, to open what she had kept closed, and the thing she had been afraid to build had turned out to be more solid than anything she had imagined in the years when she was keeping herself safe. She was 30 years old in the spring of 1888, the same spring as Meredith's baby, and she stood in front of her students one April morning, with the sun coming through the schoolhouse windows in the particular flat, warm way of a desert spring, 26 children in front of her from 6 to 15, all of them with their attention on her, with the quality of attention that is only given freely when it is earned. And she felt the full scope of what she was doing as if seeing it clearly for the first time. She was building them. She was giving them the tools to walk forward with more than they had come in with, and some of them would carry those tools far from Dustfield, and some would use them right here. And all of it was real and mattered, and none of it had been possible in the years when she was not present enough to give it. She thought of Pearl Vasquez, who was now in Santa Fe writing letters that had already been published in the territorial newspaper. She thought of Henry Danforth, 17, and preparing to take an examination for the territorial teachers' college himself. Henry, who had needed more than she had to give when he arrived, and who had gotten it anyway because she had written to Santa Fe and insisted. She thought of James Cole, the watchful boy from Tennessee who was now 15 and quick with mathematics and who had found, slowly and firmly, the kind of belonging in Dustfield that she recognized from the inside. She thought about what it meant to be given the chance to do work that was fully yours. That evening she rode home in the late April light and found Nelson at the corral with Roberto, finishing the day's work, and he saw her coming and raised his hand in the way that was both ordinary and everything, and she urged Penny into a trot over the last stretch. She dismounted and he came to take the horse, and she put her arms around him without ceremony, her chin on his shoulder, and held on. "Good day?" he asked, his hand coming up to her back. "Very good," she said. "Just wanted to do this." He held her back with the same easy sureness. "All right," he said. It was summer of 1889 that brought the one real scare, the one that made everything that had been solid feel briefly, terrifyingly uncertain. Nelson had been working with a young stallion that had come to him as a problem case from a rancher who had given up on training him. The stallion, a gray with a difficult history of mistreatment, had been making steady progress for 3 months when on a Wednesday morning something spooked him badly, a rattlesnake in the corner of the corral, and in the explosive scramble that followed, Nelson was caught against the fence. He was not gored or kicked in any mortal sense, but 2 ribs on his right side were badly cracked, and he had a deep contusion along his arm that Dr. Hale, called out to the ranch within the hour, treated with the solemnity of a man assessing something that could have been considerably worse. "You need to lie down," Dr. Hale told him, with the expression of a doctor who knows exactly how his instructions are going to be received. "I have horses to see to," Nelson said. "Roberto and Frank will see to the horses," Catherine said from the doorway. Her voice was entirely level. Her hands, she noted, were trembling slightly inside her sleeves. Nelson looked at her face and lay down. He healed over 6 weeks, which he spent in a state of determined productivity that did not involve physical labor. He painted 3 landscapes, wrote out a complete training record for every horse on the property, taught Samuel, now 5, every constellation he knew, and drove Catherine to a moderate but real limit of patience approximately twice per week, which she accepted as the cost of loving someone who was built for motion. On the evening he was cleared by Dr. Hale to resume full activity. He was sitting on the porch steps and she was sitting beside him, and Samuel and William were chasing fireflies in the pasture grass below, their small figures bright with movement in the summer dusk. "You scared me," she said. "I know," he said. "I am sorry." "That is not why I am saying it," she said. "I am saying it because I want you to know, because keeping things inside myself was a habit I had and I am trying to be done with it." He put his arm around her and pulled her close. "I hear you," he said, "and it will not happen again." "You cannot promise that," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I can promise I will not take unnecessary risks. And I can promise that if anything ever does happen, you will have built something that is yours, not just ours. The school, the reputation, the life here, that belongs to you independently." She looked at him. "Is that what you think about, making sure I would be all right without you?" "Sometimes," he said honestly. "Is that strange?" "No," she said. "It is exactly like you." They watched Samuel catch a firefly and hold it cupped in his hands, face bent to the glow of it, and William hop around him trying to look in, and the evening was large and warm and full. "I love you," she said, which she said often and meant every time. "I love you," he said back, which was always true and always enough. The rail yard opened in Dustfield in the autumn of 1889, and with it came the expected flood of newcomers, some of whom Catherine welcomed and some of whom she assessed with a watchfulness that had been sharpened rather than softened by the years. Not every person who arrived in a growing town arrived with honest intentions, and she had learned long ago to tell the difference. But the town had also learned, in its years of growing, how to hold its shape. Amos Prout was still sheriff, still quiet and steady, and the civic committee that Catherine served on had laid groundwork that the boom did not entirely upend. Nelson sold horses to 3 new ranchers who came in with the railway expansion, and evaluated each of them with the same care he brought to everything, making the same decisions he always had, which was to say, based on the people rather than the money. He turned away one potential buyer whose treatment of his existing horses told Nelson everything he needed to know. He extended the same favorable terms to a young Mexican family who had come with the railway work and were trying to establish a small horse operation of their own because he recognized what he was looking at. The young man from that family, whose name was Alejandro Reyes, turned out to be gifted, and Nelson spent considerable time over the following months sharing what he knew freely and without conditions, because he remembered being young in a territory that was not always inclined to give young men what they needed to succeed, and he believed that what you gave to someone who deserved it came back to the world in ways you could not always trace but that were real. By 1890, Dustfield had 240 residents, a railway stop, a proper hotel, a second church, a physician's office, a school with 4 teachers and a new building, and the kind of settled confidence that comes to a place after it has survived enough to know that it can. Catherine's school had produced, By the count she kept in her own careful records, 4 students who had gone on to higher education in Santa Fe or Albuquerque, 11 who had become teachers in other territorial towns, and any number who had gone on to the specific and undervalued work of building lives that were honest and whole and connected to the people around them. She could not track all of them, and she had learned not to need to. The work was in the giving. Where it went was its own journey. Pearl Vasquez had, by 1890, published a series of essays in the Albuquerque newspaper about education in the territories and the particular challenges facing students from Spanish-speaking households who were required to learn in English-only essays that were widely read and sharply argued, and that Catherine considered among the finest pieces of writing to come out of anything she had been part of. Pearl had written to her about them with a mix of fire and careful credit that made Catherine proud in the specific way that the best teaching produces, the pride of watching someone become wholly, independently themselves. Samuel turned 7 in 1890 and was, predictably, already the most serious student in his own classroom. He read at a level that would have impressed Catherine professionally, and which, as his mother, simply made her smile in a way she tried to contain in professional settings. He had Nelson's quality of attention, that unhurried, genuinely present listening, and Catherine's habit of precision with language, and the combination made him, at 7, something of an anomaly among the other children, who regarded him with a mix of mild bewilderment and considerable respect. William, 5, was loud and generous and ferociously physical, and he had formed a friendship with Alejandro Reyes's son, a boy named Marco who was also 5 and similarly built for movement, and the two of them together were a force of nature that required more than ordinary supervision. But William also had, when he chose to apply it, an emotional intelligence that surprised people, a sensitivity to the feelings of those around him that ran deeper than his surface noise, and which showed itself in small, reliable ways, like the time he gave his favorite carved horse to a younger child at school who was crying about something and could not be comforted any other way. Nelson, who had seen it happen from across the yard, said nothing about it until that evening, and then only said to his son, "That was very kind today." And William had shrugged with the casualness of someone for whom kindness was simply the obvious choice. On a December evening in 1890, with the first real snow of the season coming down outside the windows, and the stove burning steadily and both boys long since asleep, Catherine and Nelson sat together at the table where he was finishing an account book, and she was reading a letter from Pearl Vasquez. The letter was long and full of news and sharp observations, and she read out the best parts and Nelson listened and commented, and they sat like that for an hour in the warm, lit quiet of their house while the snow collected outside. And then he closed the account book, and she set the letter down, and he looked at her across the table with the same gray-green eyes she had first really looked at through a Whitmore's window on a morning in April that felt like another lifetime, and also like this morning. "We have had a good life," he said, not sadly but with the fullness of a man who is looking at it squarely. "We are having a good life," she corrected. "We are not done," he smiled. "You are right. We have more children to raise," she said. "More horses to train, more students to give things to, more winters on this ridge." "More winters," he agreed, in a tone that made it sound like a gift, which she supposed it was. She got up from her chair and came around the table, and he pushed his chair back to make room, and she sat beside him with her head against his shoulder in the way she had been doing for 8 years and which had never become ordinary, not once. "I was so certain," she said. "About what?" "That this place would not give me anything worth keeping, that the men who worked it would not be worth trusting." She paused. "I was so utterly certain." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What changed it?" "Still the horse," she laughed softly. "Still the horse, and the man who apologized to her." She lifted her head and looked at him. "She is the real hero of this story, you know, Clover. If she had not looked tired that morning, I might never have stopped to listen." She knew what she was doing, Nelson said, with the absolute seriousness of a man who meant it. Outside, the snow was deep now, covering the ridge and the pasture and the corrals, and in the barn Clover was warm in her stall, old and well-fed and untroubled, and the other horses were quiet, and the house on the ridge held its light steadily against the winter dark, and the two people inside it were entirely, unreservedly at home. This was the thing Catherine had not been able to imagine. In the spring of 1882, arriving on a platform with a carpetbag and a derringer, and all of her carefully maintained distance. Not the house, not the children, not the school or the ridge or the horses, but this, the feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be, with exactly who you are supposed to be with, and having earned every inch of it with your own honest hands. She had come to the frontier suspicious and defended and right to be both of those things, given what she had come from. The frontier was real in its harshness. It had taken real things from real people, and it was not a place for illusions. But it was also a place where a man could stand at a hitching post in the early morning and speak to a tired horse with genuine remorse and genuine care, and where a woman who had needed to see that very thing could happen to be standing close enough to hear it, and where what came from that small, private, unremarkable moment could grow into a whole life. A whole, complete, deeply loved life. Samuel made a sound from the back bedroom, some small sound of sleep, and Catherine turned her head toward it automatically, and then relaxed, and Nelson's arm tightened briefly around her shoulder, and the snow fell outside on the ridge and the grassland and the whole wide New Mexico territory. And in the schoolroom in town, the watercolor painting of the creek still hung on the wall where she had put it, and would be there for all the years of children who came after, giving them something beautiful to look at without knowing its story, which was, perhaps, exactly right.